Greetings and welcome to Ethio-Digest. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin today's program by summarizing breaking news that is directly related to the subject matter of our presentation. After this brief summary, we will present two very important announcements. We'll then conclude this session with our commentary on the current state of affairs in Ethiopia. Thank you for staying with us. First, the news. Anti-government demonstrations across the Amhara region by great numbers of people are getting everyone's attention. The demonstrators came out demanding for peace before elections. They came out demanding for the end of war and the end of Abiy Ahmed's regime. They also warned the United Arab Emirates to not interfere in Ethiopia's domestic issues. This protest, some believe, is the harbinger for a nationwide resistance movement that will close its very first chapter by ousting the Arat Kilo colonel. Ethio-Digest continues to monitor this development. This will take us directly to two very important announcements. The first one is from the Abronet platform. This message is addressed to all Ethiopians across the globe. The contents of the message are this. This coming Saturday, April 4th, 2026, a virtual protest and demonstration will be held at 6 p.m. in the evening, Addis Ababa time, or 11 a.m. in the morning, Washington, D.C., or Eastern Standard Time. All Ethiopians are urged to participate in this historic demonstration, whose ultimate goal is to end the war, to end the tyrannical regime, and to establish a lasting peace. The program will be live-streamed via several satellite television and YouTube channels. Please join this rare and highly esteemed act of resistance against the sworn enemy of Ethiopians and the region. The second announcement we have refers to an upcoming new program on our YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to inform you, our viewers, that we will hold our very first interview in the coming days with a very special first guest. Please make sure to tune in as we premiere this program, because this interview with a prominent politician in the middle of the Ethiopian political landscape would be something you don't want to miss. Better yet, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can be guaranteed to be notified directly and tune in and enjoy our programs. Thank you for staying with us. And now, let's go directly to our featured presentation. War and Elections. The Marriage of the Ballot and the Bullet. Ladies and gentlemen, we feel obliged to construe the reality on the ground and direct your attention to this formidable, complex and explosive phenomena, an election in the backdrop of a perpetual destructive war. In today's Ethiopian political landscape, the coexistence of these two diametrically opposite phenomena has taken center stage. And when we continue to explore Ethiopia's pre-existing war, juxtaposed against an election that has become another war front and is already costing lives, we are faced with controversies that need our full attention. Following the statement by the Amhara Fano National Movement regarding the upcoming election, several groups and entities have come out and voiced their stance on the issue. The first one being the press release by the OLF, which we will present in its entirety. And the second one was the statement by the Coalition for Ethiopian Unity, a group of 5 different parties who have joined hands to run against the ruling party in the upcoming general election. We intend to summarize this statement, along with the organizational stance the TPLF has currently adopted regarding this complex subject matter. An unbiased look at the pros and cons of holding an election under the present circumstances introduces a subject of debate in the opposition camp. How do we proceed in our struggle for survival, and how do we put an end to the current tyrannical regime? The answer to this fundamental question by all the stakeholders predetermines whether a group or an individual would raise arms and vanquish the regime or would follow a peaceful means of changing the system. Allowing the regime to legitimize its grip of power for another 5 years, however, is not acceptable by the majority of Ethiopians. Thus, the overwhelming response to this profound and ageless question left no room for ambiguity. Thanks to the press release by the Amhara Fano National Movement, spearheading this unapologetic stance of the opposition groups and parties on this subject, elections are out of the question. Except for a few designated lapdogs of the Prosperity Party, who have sworn to escort the regime in this sham election and crown Abiy Ahmed Ali. Most Ethiopians are involved in and support the struggle to remove the regime by any means necessary, which includes armed struggle. Obviously, the statement by the Amhara Fano National Movement represents the voice of the overwhelming majority of Ethiopians. But on the other hand, even after realizing that this tyrannical regime would not address their fundamental problems regarding their lack of peace and security, regarding the hunger and displacement they are enduring, and that it would continue to disregard their right to life, a significant portion of the population is understandably exhausted by war and violence, and would not involve itself in overthrowing the government by force. At this critical and decisive moment, however, the statement that cleared up the confusion and the statement that once again drew the line between friends and foes came from none other than the Amhara Fano National Movement. This statement did not only raise eyebrows across the political landscape, but also made it known that the Amhara Fano National Movement was not going to tolerate the birds embedded in this entourage poised to genuflect, escort, and crown the despot of the century, Abiy Ahmed Ali. What followed this resonating statement by the Amhara Fano National Movement is probably the icing on the cake for Ethiopians across the land. What do we mean by that? Let us explain. On March 23, 2026, the Oromo Liberation Army came out with a press release that did not only corroborate the position of the Amhara Fano National Movement, but also reminded and warned Ethiopians about the 6 different ploys the regime is unfurling across the land. The emergence of this statement sent shockwaves to Arat Kilo, not only because it exposed half a dozen or so of the most atrocious, savage and criminal plots in Abiy Ahmed's arsenal, but also because it confirmed and cemented and sealed the genuine alliance between the Oromo and their brothers and sisters across the land. And by doing so, it put to rest the stereotypical notion that all ethnic groups, including the Amharas, Tigrayans, Oromos, and others, could not align together against a common existential threat and their common sworn enemy. Let us look at this brief and articulate message from the Oromo Liberation Army, Oromo Liberation Front, an Oromo Liberation Front and an Oromo Liberation Army press release. As Abiy Ahmed gauges the posture of his patron in the Middle East war before he starts his own war in the north, he is poised to deploy a series of incendiary cards over the coming weeks and months. The Finfinne card. He intends to dangle the prospect of incorporating Finfinne into Oromia, a gambit designed to rekindle the Oromo-Amhara hostilities. Mid-level cadres have already been tasked with preparing a document to serve as the basis for a draft proclamation. The election card. By now, the notion of election has been reduced to little more than a performance staged for foreign consumption, with over 70% of the country beyond the reach of any credible electoral process. Abiy can only orchestrate a hollow ritual within the few urban enclaves. Major independent parties have either already withdrawn from the process or are participating in the capital solely to avoid deregistration or to expose the charade before exiting. All remaining parties in the process are either created by or colluding with the regime. The Kero card. Abiy is deploying co-opted individuals to hijack the movement's name and symbolism in an attempt to fracture the Oromo youth. Dressing regime loyalists in garments of struggle with banners of silencing the gun among brothers, while the majority of Kero remain silenced and unemployed, is an exercise in futility. The Region card. In recent weeks, Abiy's agents carried out massacres against Orthodox Christians in Arsi. Subsequently, his mayor presided over conciliatory talks with Orthodox fathers in the capital, deepening these sectarian wounds while projecting an air of piety remains very much on the table. The border dispute card. Abiy will stoke disputes along the borders of Oromia, particularly in Wallagga, and across the country. Plans are already underway to inaugurate an Amhara movement in Wallagga to start the flame. Other fault lines are equally primed: the borders between Oromia and Amhara, Oromia and Somali, and the ones between Amhara and Tigray. Wherever ambiguity exists, he intends to set it ablaze. The constitutional reform card. To bait some in the Amhara elite, Abiy plans to promise quick creation of smaller regional states carved from the existing ones, whether through a manipulated constitutional process under Article 47 or the hollow theater of national dialogue. Among the territories under discussion is the regional state of Wolkite and a few other zones in Oromia and Amhara. Stakeholders across the country have largely deciphered Abiy's moves. The only result he will achieve by pulling these levers is civilian casualties. International partners must immediately exert pressure to protect the civilian population. OLA will provide further details as necessary. The OLF-OLA High Command, March 23, 2026. Ladies and gentlemen, without delving into this self-explanatory historical statement by the OLA-OLF, we should bring forth the statement by the Coalition for Ethiopian Unity. The statement that came out on March 24, 2026, confirmed what the overwhelming number of Ethiopians, including the Amhara Fano National Movement, the Oromo Liberation Army, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and others, have already concluded. It stipulated that Amhara and Tigray regions, the Oromia region, excepting a few urban centers, and the Matakal zone of Benishangul Gumuz region, are war zones and are too dangerous for all Ethiopians. And also the fact that the chance that holding elections does not exist. The coalition ended up suspending its election campaigns in those and many other parts of the country. Summarizing this back and forth on the subject, however, Amhara Fano National Movement acknowledged that the decision and statement made by the Coalition of Ethiopian Unity is acceptable by the organization. While this outcome is an encouraging step in the right direction, the statement by the Coalition of Ethiopian Unity also portrays a grim picture of the war zones where elections will not be held. The denial of these dire circumstances and the talk about holding an election is viewed by many as another tragedy unfolding in real time. The pictures promoting Abiy Ahmed's re-election campaign omit a few vital achievements by the Prosperity Party. For better or worse, these achievements must be cited. Let us briefly look at the highlights in this blood-stained mosaic that was conveniently omitted in their campaign literature. Guns and ammo of every maker that made mass murder technologically possible in Ethiopia, along with the unfortunate child soldiers that are dying across the country, along with the 43% of Ethiopians that are languishing in poverty and more than 20 million Ethiopians that are hungry, along with the more than 4 million Ethiopians that are facing acute hunger, along with the millions and millions of displaced Ethiopians dying of disease, malnutrition, and violence, along with the many thousands of Ethiopians that were forced to leave their homeland and became victims of the savage waters of the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and the Red Sea, and along with the unfortunate thousands of Ethiopians that became legitimate targets of criminal networks run by human trafficking generals in Abiy Ahmed's army. And last but not least, along with the tens of millions of school-age Ethiopian children that are designated targets of Brahanu Jula's ragtag army. These would have been probably the most appropriate and the most realistic and the best fitting portrayals representing Abiy Ahmed's Ethiopia and his campaign literature. Thus, the reality on the ground, as authenticated by world-renowned institutions, and the pain and suffering Ethiopians are enduring in real time, is conveniently excluded from the picture the delusional kid wanted to exhibit. Even the so-called National Ethiopian Board of Elections, known for its status as a non-voting and non-speaking member of the Prosperity Party, did not include Tigray in its ridiculous chart. Yes, 100% of Tigray is not holding elections. Because, let alone a general election which would require peaceful conditions on the ground, huge resources and political space and inclusion of all the stakeholders, let alone that sort of elections. Even those pathetic and frivolous so-called dialogue commission sessions regarding Tigray are held in Arat Kilo, more than 700 kilometers away from the very owners of the dialogue. While the state of affairs in Tigray does not allow the region to hold elections, nothing would come close to what went down in the Amhara region in confirming to us the absence of peace. The omnipresence of the bullet in this imagery of our farcical ballot is the saddest truth. The taking of election officials as prisoners in Gojam, Wollo, South and Central Gondar, and the attacks targeting polling stations by Fano forces opened up the curtains, revealing not only the most telling episode about the regime's stature and confidence to hold elections, but also the fact that the election is another war front. People are losing lives. Running for office in the current election, 3 top officials of the Amhara region, namely the President of the Amhara region, the Deputy Prime Minister of the nation, and the Speaker of the House of Federation, were unable to go back to the localities they came from. This embarrassing and self-incriminating song and dance was made public when the 3 amigos, also known as the 3 Stooges, chose to abandon their constituents in Gojam and Takusa for security reasons, and decided to run for their seats in Bahar Dar and Gondar. This cowardly act of reshuffling, restructuring, and gerrymandering, if you will, while claiming the region to be peaceful enough to hold elections, is at best a self-incriminating deceptive testimony. The buffoonery and farce in this spectacle surpass any slapstick comedy or any circus and scandal we could have imagined. What is claimed to be free and fair election began by the Prime Minister taking the most hilarious initial step, the assigning of seats. What does that mean? Let us explain. The sham elections designed to have one winner is viewed by many as tarnished by a self-inflicted image of corruption and glorified greed. and lacked inclusiveness and abandoned the most basic prerequisites to ensure a democratic process. A process that takes freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of movement for granted. This disgraceful state, and the possible blame and the objection that could arise from the international community, forced the regime to try to convince observers that the free and fair election had allowed opposition parties to win seats in the Ethiopian parliament. With this goal in mind, Abiy Ahmed Ali assigned seats to a couple of parties he had relied on in the past election, namely Aben and Izema, and he also appointed individuals in the entertainment field and investors and influential and wealthy individuals, and leaned on them to run for a seat in the House, as he cleverly did in the previous election and gave a free run to Daniel Kibret, who ran as an independent and joined parliament. Colonel Ahmed Ali entertained repeating the same slick venture and instructed his so-called Central Committee to withdraw the re-election bid of his party's candidates in districts that are assigned to these hand-picked reliable agents, thereby guaranteeing their inclusion in parliament. This cheap and common PR stunt should not be the focus of Ethiopians, whose very survival as independent people is at stake, and whose universally declared rights as humans have been denied and revoked. Let's not entertain something like the coming back to normalcy in Tigray region, whose fate was sealed when the Pretoria Agreement evaporated into thin air. This moment was marked by a speech Colonel Ahmed Ali gave in the Ethiopian parliament, stating that the agreement was not signed with the TPLF and the federal government, but between the individual signatories, Getachew Redda and Tzadkan Gebrehiwot, and the federal government. This defiance to the agreement understandably prompted the TPLF to give up on the implementation of the agreement. Thus, the only roadmap to revive and reinstate Tigray is no more. And the only constitutional provision that guarantees its inclusion in the national election, and the provision that allows it to resume to represent itself, is biting the dust. Based on our assessment of the active ethnic cleansing campaign in the Amhara region, the massacres in Oromia, and the entire population of Tigray that is under siege, holding an election in any one of these regions will not materialize. This unbecoming reality on the ground, however, has prompted the National Ethiopian Board of Elections to whitewash the vivid, untenable circumstances that the nation is dwelling in. Even after scratching off one of the regions from being part of this sham election, and even after admitting that elections will not take place in thousands of voting centers across the country, the delusional election board presented us with an amusing schedule showing the possibility of holding an election. The main character in this infantile melodrama, also known as NEBE, National Ethiopian Board of Elections, which answers directly to Abiy Ahmed, is to say the least hired to guarantee two things: the holding and winning of a sham election by Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party. And equally important, Nebe, the same kangaroo court in this cinematic display of the world of make-believe, wants to paint a fair and free election for public consumption. It is humbling and humiliating to admit that we are witnessing an implicit and deliberate scandalization of a democratic process by the two-legged venomous reptile of Arat Kilo and his repulsive and grotesque nature. In conclusion, we must appreciate the open political discourse which is indicative of the virtual presence of commitment and dedication, and the emerging wisdom and growth of the leaders of this struggle, which is considered to be an absolute necessity in the people's pursuit of peace and happiness, and their quest for truth and justice. It is this wisdom and dedication that will allow the formation of our common front and inclusive coalition. It is this open-mindedness that would guarantee the overcoming of the formidable challenges and forge a realistic roadmap. Ladies and gentlemen, as humiliating and as shameful as it amounts to be, and as abhorring and heart-wrenching an experience it will become known as for generations to come, too many vibrant and courageous freedom fighters and too many innocent civilians have perished and will perish in this war of liberation. And in this respect, the election project, and according to the Oromo Liberation Army, one of the 6 ploys Abiy Ahmed has in his arsenal, is nothing more or nothing less than another war front, where everyday people will continue to be the casualties. It is this harsh reality and this cycle of violence, presently sponsored and conducted by the colonel, that presses us to conclude that putting an end to the regime is the only way out and the only way forward. In the final analysis, yes, elections will be held, but only after a transitional government and a transitional period. The end of tyranny, the end of war, and the re-establishment of peace will materialize before people go to the polls. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our presentation for the day. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you the best of times.